Cursed beyond the grave. The night was thick with the scent of rain, the kind that soaked into the earth and made the cemetery feel more alive than it should have. Ethan had never believed in ghosts, curses, or anything remotely supernatural. He was a rational man, a history enthusiast with a deep fascination for old graveyards and forgotten stories. When he and his two friends, Mark and Danny, decided to visit the abandoned Black Hollow Cemetery, they thought they were chasing nothing more than a local legend. Black Hollow wasn't on any modern maps. Hidden deep within the forest, it was a place whispered about in hushed tones by the older generation. It was said that those buried there were not meant to rest peacefully, that something had gone terribly wrong with their burials. Some spoke of cursed soil, others of a vengeful entity that fed on those who disturbed the graves. None of it mattered to Ethan. He wanted proof. A real story. Something he could document. The three of them had driven as far as they could before the road gave out, leaving them to hike the rest of the way. The trees loomed overhead like skeletal fingers, their branches swaying in the cold wind. Their flashlights flickered as they stepped onto the soft, overgrown ground of the cemetery. The gravestones were ancient, some cracked and crumbling, their inscriptions nearly erased by time. Jesus, this place looks like it hasn't been touched in 100 years, Mark muttered, brushing aside a vine-covered stone. Danny knelt near one of the graves, tracing the name with his fingers. Margaret Holloway, 1874 to 1901. Beneath her name, faintly visible, was a chilling inscription, "She never left." "That's unsettling," Danny whispered. Ethan was too focused on a partially sunken grave a few feet away. It was different from the others. The headstone was missing, but the ground had caved in slightly, as if the grave had been disturbed. Something about it felt wrong. "Help me dig," Ethan said, his voice filled with excitement. Mark scoffed. "Dig? Are you insane?" Ethan ignored him, grabbing a small collapsible shovel from his backpack. He always carried one for his historical explorations, but tonight, it had a darker purpose. The moment he struck the ground, a deep, resonating sound filled the air, like something hollow beneath the earth. Danny stepped back. "Dude. I don't think this is a good idea." Ethan didn't stop. The more he dug, the more uneasy the air became. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and the temperature dropped. Mark cursed under his breath but eventually joined in, scooping dirt away with his hands. Then the shovel hit something solid. A coffin. But it wasn't like any coffin they had seen before. This one was bound shut with rusted iron chains, as if someone had tried to make sure it would never be opened. Carved into the wood were symbols Ethan didn't recognize, crude, jagged markings that almost seemed burned into the surface. "Guys, let's leave this alone," Danny stammered. But Ethan's curiosity was stronger than his fear. He pried at the chains, and to his surprise, they snapped like they were barely holding together. The moment the last chain fell, the wind died. The entire forest went silent, no rustling leaves, no distant chirping of insects. Just dead air. Ethan's breath hitched as he slowly lifted the lid. The corpse inside wasn't rotting. It was pristine, as if whoever was buried here had just died moments ago. A young woman, her skin pale, her lips slightly parted as if she had been frozen mid-scream. Her hands were clawed, fingers dug into the fabric of her burial dress, as if she had tried to claw her way out. Then Ethan saw it. Her eyes were open. Not hollow. Not decayed. Alive. They stared straight at him. Unblinking. Watching. Ethan stumbled back, gasping. "No, that's not possible." Mark and Danny bolted, but Ethan was frozen. The woman's lips began to move, though no sound came out. Then the coffin lurched. Something beneath the woman moved. Shifted. Twitched. And then the screaming began. A horrible, choked, inhuman wail, not from the woman, but from below her, inside the coffin. Something was still buried beneath her. Ethan scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The wind roared back, and the cemetery erupted into chaos. The trees bent unnaturally, gravestones toppled, and the ground beneath them cracked. The coffin lid slammed shut on its own, the iron chains snapping back around it as if sealing something back in. A force threw Ethan backward, knocking the air from his lungs. He landed hard, the world spinning around him. Mark and Danny were screaming for him to run. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He staggered to his feet and ran, heart pounding, legs shaking, the sound of distant, echoing whispers chasing after him. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. And even then, the whispers didn't stop. That night, when Ethan tried to sleep, something scratched at his window. And when he turned on his phone to check his messages, a single text flashed across the screen. "You let it out." Ethan barely slept. The whispering hadn't stopped when he made it home. It followed him, faint, like a breath against the back of his neck, just on the edge of hearing. At first, he thought it was paranoia. He wanted it to be paranoia. But every time he tried to convince himself, something would shift in the darkness of his room. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, the air heavier. And then there was the text. "You let it out." It had no sender. No number. Just those 4 words, glaring at him from his phone screen like a warning straight from hell. He deleted it. Turned off his phone. But at exactly 3:33 a.m., his phone lit up on its own, screen flickering, battery completely dead, yet somehow displaying the same message again. Ethan lay there, staring at the screen, his body paralyzed with fear. Then he heard it. The scratching. Slow, deliberate, coming from his bedroom window. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch. It was too precise, too rhythmic. Scrape. 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 His breath hitched. He turned his head toward the window, pulse hammering in his ears. The curtains were slightly open. And through the tiny gap, he saw her. The woman from the grave. Standing outside. Watching him. Her dead, unmoving eyes locked onto his. Her lips, slightly parted, as if she was still mid-scream. Her fingers, pale and clawed, pressed against the glass, scraping down slowly. Ethan's body refused to move. Then she tilted her head. Not a normal tilt. Too sharp. Too unnatural. The bones in her neck made a wet, snapping sound as her head jerked almost to her shoulder. Her fingers twitched against the glass. And then she was inside. The bed creaked. Ethan's breath stopped. He could feel her weight pressing down near his feet. The mattress sagged. She was crawling onto the bed. His eyes darted downward, but he couldn't see her. Only darkness. He felt the pressure near his legs, then his stomach. Closer. Closer. Climbing on top of him. And then, cold breath against his ear. A voice like broken glass whispered. "You shouldn't have opened it." His scream shattered the silence. The lights exploded, bulbs bursting in a spray of sparks. The moment he could move, he lunged for the lamp and switched it on. She was gone. Nothing but the open window, even though he had locked it before bed. The scratching was on the inside now. The curse spreads. Ethan wasn't the only one suffering. The next morning, Mark called him, his voice shaking. "Dude. I think something's wrong with Danny." Ethan's stomach turned to ice. "What do you mean?" "We need to see him. Now." They drove to Danny's apartment, both of them silent. The air between them was heavy with unspoken fear. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. When they arrived, the door was unlocked. And the stench hit them instantly. Rot. Like something long dead. Danny's apartment was a wreck. Furniture overturned. Scratches on the walls, not like an animal, but like fingernails had been dragged across them. Danny sat on the floor in the corner of the room, staring, eyes wide, bloodshot, sunken. His hands were raw and bleeding, nails ripped down to the skin as if he had been clawing at something. "Danny?" Ethan whispered. Danny's head snapped toward him so violently it looked like his neck would snap. His lips moved, but at first, no sound came out. Then he whispered something. Over and over. "She's in the walls." Mark shook him. "Danny, snap out of it." "What the hell happened?" Danny blinked. His pupils were wrong, too large, swallowing most of the color in his eyes. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he said, "It's still hungry." And then the lights went out. The room plunged into total darkness. Ethan's breath hitched as a cold wave of dread washed over him. Mark swore under his breath, gripping Danny's shoulders, but Danny just stared into the void, unblinking, unmoving. Then came the sound. Not the whispering. Not the scratching. Something breathing. Slow. Ragged. Right next to them. Ethan fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, thumb smashing against the screen to turn on the flashlight. Click. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing Danny's apartment had changed. The walls were wrong. The scratches were deeper now, stretching to the ceiling, forming twisted symbols that pulsed and bled. The air felt thicker, heavy with an invisible weight pressing down on them. And then they saw it. A shadow, not a trick of the light, not a figure standing in the corner. It was something crawling along the ceiling. Too fast. Too impossibly thin. It skittered across the surface like an insect, limbs jerking, its head twisting unnaturally as if sensing them. Its mouth, long and jagged, split open too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Danny screamed. The thing dropped from the ceiling. Ethan barely had time to react before the room erupted into chaos. Mark grabbed Danny, yanking him to his feet, but Danny's body convulsed violently, his back arching at an inhuman angle. His mouth fell open, his eyes rolled back. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, he laughed. The deep, guttural sound rattled the walls. "You opened the door," the voice rasped from Danny's throat. "Now we can come through." Ethan grabbed Mark's arm. "Get him out of here. Now." They ran, dragging Danny's shuddering body toward the door. But the shadow moved faster. It lunged, its limbs extending unnaturally, its clawed fingers inches from Ethan's throat. And then it stopped. Frozen. Twitching. Danny was whispering. Low. Unintelligible. His lips moving too fast, forming words that didn't sound human. His eyes were black now, void-like, his entire body trembling. And the thing backed away. It was afraid of him. Danny turned his head toward Ethan, his expression empty. Then he spoke in that horrible, double-voiced rasp. "You let her out." But she wasn't alone. The mark of the grave. They got Danny out of the apartment, but he didn't seem right. He sat in the back seat of Mark's car, silent, staring straight ahead. His hands twitched. His nails were still broken and bleeding from clawing at the walls, but he didn't seem to notice. Ethan turned to Mark. "We need help." "Help? Who the hell do we even call for something like this?" Mark gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. "An exorcist? A damn priest?" Ethan's stomach turned. He knew Mark was right. This wasn't normal. Danny suddenly spoke, voice flat and monotone. "She's still with us." Mark slammed the brakes. "What?" Danny slowly raised his hand, his fingers twitching, then pressed it to his chest. Ethan's blood ran cold. There was something beneath his skin. A lump. Small, but moving. Ethan barely had time to react before Danny convulsed violently in the seat. His mouth ripped open in a silent scream, and something began to press against the inside of his throat. Something trying to crawl out. Ethan grabbed his shoulders. "Danny, stay with me." Danny's body jerked violently, his fingers digging into Ethan's arms. Then he choked out one last phrase before the thing inside him shifted again. "She left something inside me." And then he stopped breathing. Danny's body lay still in the back seat, his chest barely rising and falling. His eyes, though still glassy, had returned to normal, or at least, what seemed normal. There was no blood, no sign of anything that had attacked him. But Ethan could feel it. Something had changed. Something dark had gotten inside. "Mark. What the hell do we do now?" Ethan whispered, the words catching in his throat. He had never felt such a cold dread, an all-consuming feeling of helplessness. Mark kept his eyes fixed on the road, knuckles tight against the wheel, his face drawn in fear and disbelief. "I don't know," Mark muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "But we need to get Danny to a hospital." Ethan shook his head, unable to look away from his friend's motionless form in the back seat. "No. He's not. He's not right. You saw what happened in the apartment. This is something else." As they drove, the shadows outside the car seemed to lengthen unnaturally, the streetlights flickering in an unsettling rhythm. The air grew thicker, the silence inside the car suffocating. Suddenly, Danny jerked, his head snapping up in an almost unnatural motion, eyes wide with an expression of pure horror. He gasped, as though choking on something unseen, and then screamed. But it wasn't Danny's voice. It was hers. The same woman from the grave. The one they had released. The one that now haunted them all. "You can't escape me." The voice echoed through the car, low and suffocating, as if it was coming from all directions at once. "I will never let you go." Ethan slammed his hand over Danny's mouth, but the scream continued, rising in pitch, growing more distorted. Mark swerved the car, panic flooding his system. "We have to get him out of here. This is insane." But the moment Mark took his eyes off the road, the world outside the car blurred, the trees lining the street becoming twisted, bent shapes. The road seemed to stretch on forever, endless, as if they were driving in circles. "Mark! Stop!" Ethan yelled. "What's happening?" The air in the car grew thick, a sickening pressure building around them. Danny, still shaking violently in the back seat, whispered hoarsely, "It's not just her. It's them." Ethan turned around, his heart freezing at the sight of Danny's body twisting unnaturally. The lump under his skin, it was growing, pushing against his flesh as though something was trying to claw its way out. Ethan reached out, desperate to help, but then it happened. Danny's body split open. Not like a cut or a wound, more like the skin itself was being ripped apart by an unseen force. Something was crawling out of him. Dozens of hands. Grasping. Clawing. Scratching. The hands were not human. Their skin was blackened, wrinkled, stretched thin across bone. Fingers like twisted branches, nails too long, too sharp. They seemed to emerge from Danny's body, tearing through the remains of his chest as if it was nothing more than paper. Ethan recoiled in terror, but it was too late. The hands pulled themselves free, and they weren't the only things. The thing inside Danny was alive. It was shifting, moving, taking form, as if it had a will of its own. The car filled with the sound of wet tearing, of skin being violated, and then, like a horrible afterthought, something else emerged. A head. A face. A face that was not Danny's. It was her face. The woman from the grave. Her dead, rotting features contorted into something grotesque and otherworldly, her eyes wide with hunger. She smiled, revealing rows of yellow teeth, sharp and jagged. She opened her mouth, and a voice, Danny's voice, but twisted beyond recognition, spoke. "You can't run from me anymore. Mark slammed on the brakes, his foot pressed down as far as it would go. The tires screeched, but the car didn't stop. It continued to slide forward, as though the world around them had suddenly tilted. And then the car stopped. Not gently, but with a violent jolt. The headlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. Ethan blinked, trying to focus his blurry vision. Then he realized. They weren't on the road anymore. They were in a different place. The trees surrounding them were bent and broken, their trunks cracked and split, as though they had been twisted by something unnatural. The sky above was dark, but not the usual night dark. This was a black void, as if the stars had been sucked out of existence. And there, standing in the center of the road, waiting, was the woman. The one they had released. The one that was now free. Her skeletal hand stretched toward them, her fingers growing longer, inching toward the car as if she was going to pull them into the void with her. Ethan gripped the door handle, ready to break free, but as he looked back at Danny, he saw that his friend was no longer just a victim. Danny was becoming her. The transformation was happening right before their eyes. His skin was decaying, his body twisting, as the woman's spirit tried to take root inside him, slowly eating away at the last remnants of his humanity. Ethan knew then that there was no running from this curse. They had opened the door. And now, there would be no escaping it. The air was thick with the smell of rotting earth. It clung to Ethan's nostrils, a constant reminder of the thing that had taken root inside his friend. Danny, no, it was no longer Danny, now stood in front of them, his face twisted in agony and hatred, eyes wide, pupils glowing like two dark holes sucking in every ounce of light. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't take his eyes off of the monster that had once been their friend. Danny's mouth opened, but it wasn't his voice that came out. "You thought you could run from me?" The voice was an unsettling mix of Danny's, but it was twisted, as though layered over with something darker, more ancient. The air around them seemed to pulse with the presence of something wrong, something otherworldly. The creature, Danny, stepped closer, and with every movement, the air grew colder, heavier. His body shuddered, skin stretching and cracking as something unnatural pushed at the seams, trying to break free. Ethan could hear the voice of the woman, still there, whispering in the back of his mind, her presence like a constant buzz. "You gave me life again," the voice continued. "But at a price." Ethan's heart pounded. He had to act. But what could he do? They had unleashed this thing, and now it was too late. There was no going back. "We need to leave," Mark muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. His gaze flicked between Danny and the darkness around them. "We can't fight this. We just need to leave." But as he turned to start the car again, the engine sputtered, then died completely. Ethan's stomach dropped. They were trapped. The darkness seemed to close in around them. The trees, the sky, everything felt wrong, as though the world itself had been twisted by an invisible hand. The ground under their feet was soft, almost spongy, and the air was thick with an oppressive weight. And then Danny's form shifted. It was no longer him standing in front of them, it was something else entirely. A figure. Tall, thin, a shadow with a broken face, limbs too long and jagged, as though its very form had been ripped apart and stitched back together. Ethan stumbled back in terror, but Mark stood frozen. The thing before them moved, too fast, too much like a nightmare that had come alive. It crawled toward them, dragging its body across the ground like a deformed spider, its hands, those hands, reaching for them with disjointed fingers that twitched, scratched. "You made a bargain," the creature hissed, its voice somehow simultaneously Danny's and something else entirely, something ancient, twisted, evil. "You opened the door. You can't close it now." The figure reached out, its hands closing around Mark's throat before he had a chance to react. The grip was like ice, freezing his very soul, and Mark gasped for air, struggling to break free. Ethan felt his pulse race. He couldn't let Mark die like this. Not here. Not like this. But what could they do? A low, distorted laugh echoed through the air. I am not alone, the creature whispered. Its grin stretched too wide, showing rows of sharp teeth, each one gleaming, twisted. We are many, and you are already ours. Mark's eyes went wide with terror. His hands, now grasping the creature's limbs, began to twitch violently as though something was forcing him to join the twisted mass that was Danny, no, whatever it had become. Ethan could feel the darkness closing in on them, suffocating him with an invisible force. Then, Danny's mouth opened again. This time, though, it wasn't the creature speaking. It was her. You made a choice, the voice sounded. You opened the door, and now you must live with the consequences. Ethan felt his knees buckle under the weight of the words, as though the curse itself had wrapped its claws around his heart and squeezed. There was no escape. Then, suddenly, something shifted. Mark's body began to contort, his mouth stretching wide, as if something inside him was taking control, something dark, something that shouldn't have been possible. He let out a scream, but it wasn't his voice. It was the woman's. You wanted her back. Now you'll join her in eternal suffering. Ethan watched in horror as Mark's body changed, his skin taking on a sickly hue, his eyes glazing over. His limbs cracked and dislocated at unnatural angles. Ethan's mind screamed, and his body moved without thinking. He grabbed the door handle, throwing himself out of the car. His legs hit the ground, and he ran, his heart pounding in his chest. But the air was thick, and it clung to him. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the very earth was trying to drag him back into the void. The voices, the curses, grew louder in his head, pounding against his skull. He couldn't escape. Not anymore. Behind him, Mark's voice rang out in a scream, not human anymore, as his body finally gave in to the curse. Ethan had to get out. He had to find a way to break it, to destroy whatever it was that had been set loose. But there was no place left to run. The world was changing, and there was no one left to help him. It was just him and the curse. Ethan couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, it pressed down on him from all sides, suffocating, as if the world had turned into something inhuman. The cold around him intensified, biting through his skin like 1,000 needles, and he could feel something darker, deeper, waiting in the shadows. His mind reeled, trying to process the impossible horror he had just witnessed. Mark's transformation had been quick, too complete. In a matter of moments, his friend had been reduced to something barely human, his features warped into something unnatural. He was gone, and in his place, a grotesque, twisted version of the woman now lived. Ethan's chest tightened, and he stumbled through the dark, desperate to get away, but his feet felt like they were sinking into the very earth beneath him. He looked around, he was no longer on the road. The trees had vanished, replaced by what looked like an endless void, a place of no light, no sound, just a thick, suffocating silence that drenched the air. His thoughts were clouded, his mind a storm of confusion and terror. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid, it was like a gelatinous mass, alive, twisting under his weight. Each step he took felt like it dragged him deeper into an abyss. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't just fear, it was something else. A connection, an inescapable pull toward whatever had been awakened. He wasn't alone. A whisper, soft at first, echoed through the thick silence. You think you can run? The voice was unmistakable. It was hers. The woman. The one whose curse had ripped apart their lives. Her voice slithered through the darkness, cold and malevolent. Ethan stumbled, looking around frantically, his pulse racing. He had no idea where he was or how to get out. You woke me, the voice continued, this time louder, more forceful. And now you must face the consequences. Suddenly, a sound, a cracking, like bone breaking, rang through the air. Ethan froze, his eyes darting toward the noise. It came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. From the shadows, something moved. No, someone moved. A figure. No, not just a figure, it was Mark, or what had once been Mark. His body was twisted, too thin, too long, with bone and skin stretched in ways that defied nature. His mouth was wide, too wide, and as he opened it, a sickening screech filled the air, a sound that pierced Ethan's very soul. Mark, or what was left of him, was walking toward him, his eyes hollow, his skin rotting and flaking off in pieces. He wasn't alone. There were others, creatures, following in the shadows, too many to count, their forms grotesque and formless, like shadowy remnants of the cursed. And then it hit him, the realization. They weren't in a place anymore. They were in between worlds. A place that wasn't meant for humans, a place where the curse took root. They were no longer in the world they knew. They were lost in the realm of the damned, where the dead and the cursed resided. A place where no one was meant to leave. Mark reached out toward him, and Ethan felt his blood run cold. He couldn't escape. He had tried, and the curse had followed him. It had claimed him. And it wasn't just Mark, it was everyone. "It's too late for you," Mark's voice came, but it was layered with layers of distortion, each word dripping with venom. "You opened the door, and now you're mine." Ethan's throat closed, his breath quickening as the shadowy figures continued to move closer. They were coming for him, closer, and their mouths opened in a horrific display of teeth, each one too sharp, too jagged. In a panic, Ethan bolted, his legs moving faster than they ever had before, but the ground beneath him began to shift, pulling at him, as though it was trying to swallow him whole. With every step, the creatures got closer. Their breath was cold, like the grave. Their presence was overwhelming, everywhere. He had to get out. But where? Suddenly, the darkness around him seemed to stretch and split, and from the crack, the woman appeared. Her body was hulking, towering over him, her limbs long and grotesque. Her eyes were wide, like black voids, sucking in everything around her. She smiled, that terrible, twisted grin, as she raised one bony hand toward him. "You wanted this," she whispered. "Now you'll never leave. You belong to me now." And then, with an unnatural snarl, she lunged. Ethan's heart stopped. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Time slowed to a crawl as the creature's claws descended, and he felt them cut into his skin, tearing him apart. But just as the darkness claimed him, the world around him shattered. The ground cracked open beneath him, and he was falling into an abyss of blackness, his body racked with pain, as if every muscle in him was being ripped apart. There was no escape. No salvation. Only the void. He had made the choice. He had opened the door. And now, he would never be free. As his body tumbled through the endless darkness, the last thing he heard was the laughter. The laughter of the woman, and the laughter of Mark. The curse had won. Ethan was falling. Endlessly. The abyss swallowed him, stretching into infinity, with no bottom in sight. The air was thick, pressing against his lungs like a vice, suffocating him. The darkness around him wasn't just empty, it was alive, slithering against his skin like something that breathed, something that watched. And then, the whispers started. "You don't belong here. You called us. Now you are one of us." The voices swirled in his head, layered upon one another, echoing from unseen mouths. 1,000 voices, no, millions, all speaking at once. Some pleading. Some screaming. Some laughing. Then, he stopped falling. The darkness spat him out, and he slammed onto something solid. Ethan groaned, his body aching from the impact. He pushed himself up and looked around. He wasn't on Earth anymore, not even close. The sky above him was black, endless, with stars that burned red, not like normal stars, but like open wounds, bleeding light into the void. The ground beneath him was not soil, not rock, but something, pulsing. It felt like flesh, like something alive. And then he saw them. The others. The cursed souls. They stood in a vast, endless expanse, their bodies twisted and broken, frozen in silent agony. Their mouths were open, as if mid-scream, but no sound came out. Some were missing eyes, others were split apart, their torsos torn open as if something had crawled out from within them. Ethan took a step back. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be here. And then, he heard it. A wet, dragging sound. The sound of something moving, something crawling toward him. He turned slowly, his stomach twisting in horror. It was her. The woman. No, the thing that used to be a woman. She was massive now, her body stretched into something inhuman, her limbs too long, too sharp, too wrong. Her face was a nightmare of rotting flesh, her eyes, empty pits. And she was smiling. "I told you," she whispered. "There is no escape." Ethan turned and ran. The ground beneath him moved, shifting with every step, as if trying to pull him down. He heard the screams now, the souls trapped here, their pain eternal. He was one of them now. No. No, no, no. He wouldn't accept it. He couldn't. Up ahead, through the shadows, he saw something, a door. A massive, rusted door, standing alone in the void. It looked ancient, its metal surface covered in deep scratches, as if something had clawed at it for centuries, trying to escape. A way out. He ran toward it, his breath ragged, his heart hammering. Behind him, the woman screeched, a sound that split the very air, shaking the ground beneath his feet. She was coming for him. Ethan lunged for the door, gripping its rusted handle, pulling with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. No. Please. Please. He yanked harder, his hands bleeding from the rusted edges. The woman's shadow loomed over him, her laughter a hideous, inhuman sound. "You opened the door to the curse," she whispered, her voice slithering into his ears. "But you can never close it." She reached out, her fingers elongating, splitting, turning into razor-sharp claws. Ethan screamed. He pulled one last time. The door ripped open. A blinding white light exploded from within, swallowing everything. Ethan felt himself being yanked forward, as if something was pulling him out. And then... silence. He woke up. His body jerked upright, his lungs gasping for air. He was in his bedroom. The morning sun streamed through the window, golden and warm. The air smelled like coffee, like home. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding. It had been a dream. A horrible, nightmarish dream. Ethan let out a long, shaky breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He laughed, a broken, relieved laugh. It wasn't real. It wasn't. Then he saw it. The door. The rusted door, standing in the middle of his room, its surface covered in deep, jagged scratches. And from the other side. A whisper. "You didn't escape." The door began to open. And Ethan screamed. The end.